you had just released Moist's fifth album, End of the Ocean, a few months before that interview. So now there's been 2.5 years since that release. While you're recording, you're so close to it. I feel like after 2.5 years, maybe you have a different take on it. Like it's had room to breathe. Your tentacles aren't so caught in it. And I guess, do you have like a retrospective take on that album? Because I remember it was fresh for me, and I was saying how much I love the album. I thought it was in your top two or three albums that the band had ever released. I had it in my end of the year episode for the best albums of 2022. I had it there.
I remember that. Yeah.
I remember saying Life of the Party. Is that the name of the song? Party's over.
Party's
Party's over.
over.
Yeah.
Party's over. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember saying "Party's Over" is my jam on that album. That's my favorite song. So do you have any thoughts thinking back on that album now that it's been out for a bit?
Well, a funny thing about that album is that with okay, like with Silver, for example, I remember listening to Silver when it was first done, like when we first got a mastered copy of it, and immediately going, "Oh, I wish this was better." And
Oh
then,
no.
oh yeah, for sure. And that was kind of, that was just one of those things where you just finish something and you have no perspective on it whatsoever. And the record, it ended up doing okay.
That's your
So
best-selling album, isn't it?
yeah,
Four
so
times platinum.
yeah, so four hundred
You're a harsh
thousand.
critic.
Yeah, but it took me uh like like I really enjoy the record now. It took me almost 30 years to really enjoy listening to Silver without hearing the flaws and that kind of thing. Creature, kind of the same thing, but it took me a little less time. I was probably enjoying listening to Creature after it was out for about 10 years or so. Mercedes, I kind of always enjoyed just because it's so weird and varied. But I find that with the End of the Ocean, it still comes up on my I have like the final masters just sitting on my list of songs that I cycle through. I've got, a list of 20,000 songs of my favorite that I just have on random repeat all the time. And whenever one of those songs come up, I'm always happy to hear it. So it's been no time, but I've got way fewer regrets about this record than any of the other albums we've made. So I think we must have done a pretty good job. I'm still very fond of it, and I can still put it on for fun, even though it still feels new, but I'm still really proud of what it is and what it sounds like. And yeah, I think we did a really good job. I'm still trying to sell this record one copy at a time. So whenever I run into somebody who learns that I'm in Moist and they're like, "Oh man, I loved you guys back in the day," I'm like, "Oh, hang on, do you realize that we have a new album out?" And I point them towards the Apple Music or Spotify or wherever their thing is. And yeah, it's a one person at a time kind of process getting this to the ears of people.
Well, I think we can send more than one person over. So, our listeners, go check out that album, End of the Ocean by Moist, came out in January of 2022. And do you think your faster acceptance of this album is to do with the fact that with the earlier albums, you're a young musician, there's engineers, producers, record labels, and it's like there's the time constraints and the money restraints with, recording studio time. Do you think that because you work so closely as a band making this album, that it's
Yeah.
like you were there making the decisions as it went to get to the final
Yeah.
product you're so happy
No,
with?
you're absolutely right. And the other thing about it is that we made Creature in the space of basically a couple of weekends, essentially. Sorry, not Creature. Silver was the space of a couple of weekends. Creature was like 8 days of tracking drums at Warren Heights, followed by probably 2 weeks of doing overdubs at a smaller studio in Montreal. So it was like under probably 25-day process. Probably the same for Mercedes as well. But with this record, because it was very much a pandemic project, and we were recording all of the parts independently from each other and then sending them back to Mark, who was producing the whole thing and putting it all together in his studio. So we actually took our time. It's a really good point. We took our time with it. We didn't. I feel like we did, and also we didn't have a deadline for when it was going to be released. We didn't even have to show it to anybody until we had the thing ready. So yeah, that's actually very very true. I hadn't thought about that at all.
I was actually shocked at how great the album sounded. Not that I don't think you guys are gonna, come up with this amazing sounding album, but the fact that you recorded it yourselves, it was during the pandemic, so everyone kind of had to record their own instrument and then send it over to Mark, who assembles it. And just with all those factors, you would think it would be more of an indie sounding album. It wouldn't
Yeah.
have the big studio quality. It sounds incredible. Like there's such a warmth to it.
Yeah, for
Wearing
sure.
headphones, it's a pleasant listen. A lot of times when, it's a rock band or something with an edge, a little heavier, it can be a little piercing, a little harsh sounding. That album has this thickness to it, this warmth to it. There's something about it that's inviting. I was shocked at how great it sounded for all the elements involved.
I think we got really lucky because we recorded we went and recorded the drums before COVID started at a really great studio in Toronto called Revolution Sound, which has a beautiful live room, and so we that's the one place where we weren't hobbled at all was in recording drums. And so much of the sound of a record comes from that initial drum sound and the sound of the because that's where that's when you determine whether or not the record is going to have space. Like basically, the space of the album comes from the recording of the drums, and because you really feel what room the band is sitting in and playing in when you get that happening. And so we were very fortunate that we got the drums wrapped up before, like right up, like literally. I went home from that session thinking that the world was ending the next day. We cut everything actually shorted by a day because everything was like, okay, everyone's got to go home now. The world is closing. And so we had that to begin with. We had just really great drum performances by Francis, recorded in a really great studio with a great engineer. And so Mark was able to use that as the sonic blueprint, and everything else that went in on top of it had to fit with that vibe. We knew that was the vibe we were going for, and I think that helped Mark a lot when he was making his choices about the performances and about the sounds of the instruments that we used.
Yeah, good point about needing a good sounding room for the drums is almost everything besides the drums. You're recording them, they're close mics. So the vocals are right up to the mic. So you're hearing 99.9% the direct voice and not the room.
Absolutely.
The electric guitar, you have a mic right up to the amp. You're hearing mostly just the guitar amp.
Yeah.
But the drums, you have the overheads, they're picking up the entire room. And that's why people that have home studios, they mostly have to go into the big, great sounding rooms for the drums, and then they build an album on top of that.
Yeah, you can almost always tell an indie album just by the sound of the drums. Even if they're using drum samples, these cymbals don't have the same. They sound like they're from a different spot. They don't sound like they're in the same room with the drum kit because that's the way that sampling tends to work. So yeah.
And what has the reception been like for the album over the last 2.5 years? What have you been hearing from fans? Do they compare it to past albums? Do they say, "Oh, it's so unique"? It's a current sounding album. What are you hearing from the fans?
It's been the feedback has been incredible for it. Like everybody who has heard it likes it a lot, and they tend to compare it to Creature more than any of the other Moist albums, which makes sense because Creature also was recorded a with big drums in a big space kind of thing and was built up the same way. So yeah, the feedback from everybody has been really good. I still have I don't hear from fans very much because they're people aren't our fans are busy raising children and taking care of elderly parents and that kind of thing. They're not dialed into music the way that we all were when we were 16 years old or whatever. But certainly from those that I run into and even family and friends who are have been who checked it out are very complimentary of it, and they seem to think it kind of represents a good kind of an amalgamation of all the various stages of Moist at the various times and kind of culminates 25 years of experience into 10 songs.
So after the release of the album and then after the interview that we did together, you guys then went out and did a tour across Canada from BC. I believe you made it all the way to Quebec. What were those shows like? Man, I keep thinking of the pandemic where just everything was locked down. Musicians didn't know if they would ever be able to play live again. So what was it like to actually get out there and play
It
some
was,
shows?
yeah, it was amazing. It was I mean, from the actual experience on stage was so incredible. It felt like such a release. And I think that for the first time ever, even more so than when we regrouped after a 13-year hiatus, I feel like we on stage were feeling that like, wow, I didn't like that feeling of we didn't know if we would ever do this again. And I don't think there was a single moment on stage that we took for granted. We were loving every moment of it, and I feel like the same thing was happening in the audience as well. Because for a lot of the people who were coming to see the show, it was the first time they'd gone out to see a show since the pandemic had started. So we certainly felt a lot of that back from the crowd as well. The touring itself, the travel was a bit of a nightmare because everything had just after everything being ground to a halt. The whenever it was 2.5 years ago, the there was things hadn't quite gotten back up to speed in terms of air travel and that kind of thing. You may recall there was lots of stories about horrendous backups at Pearson and issues with planes not having pilots and that kind of thing. And we encountered all of that. We
Uh,
had to
You just,
we
it just reminded me, didn't you guys have a show that you couldn't get to? Was it
yeah,
Vancouver or somewhere?
Vancouver, we couldn't get to it. So because we were trying to fly out a day before as well. Like it wasn't like we were casually trying to fly in a few hours before a show. We were leaving the day before, and we sat around the airport, and they couldn't find a pilot for the airport. They were telling us all these things that just weren't true. The plane's not there yet. The plane's not ready. We could see the plane, but apparently they didn't have anyone to fly it, and so an extremely frustrating evening. And then the next day when we were waiting to fly out because we had missed Vancouver, we managed to make it to the next show of the tour, which was Edmonton, but um yeah, so I feel now like things have gotten slightly more back to normal, which is great. So we're looking forward to doing more shows again in the semi near future and having things be slightly better off than that.
There were so many factors back then that made it difficult to tour. So the whole world was locked down. And then when it opens up, you have every band on the planet that hasn't been making money is now touring again. So
Yeah.
you have just this surplus of people trying to tour. So it's impossible to book any venues. All the tour vans are taken, all the tech guys, you need a stage tech, you need a guitar tech. They're either all taken or a bunch of them retired and became real
Yeah,
estate agents during the
absolutely.
pandemic.
Yeah.
The prices of everything went through the roof.
Yeah, it
I
was crazy.
apparently a van rental was like $10,000 to
Yeah.
get a few cities over.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was crazy and it was understandable. I mean, it was definitely a seller's market at that point because of the pent up demand, but it definitely made touring much more frustrating than, and everything would be okay if it worked, but it just there was just too many times when it didn't work. But anyway, I'm not going to complain about it because we when we're actually on stage and we were playing the songs, we were in just such an incredible happy place. So it was the stuff around that was challenging.
The actual shows made it all worth it.
They
And
did, yeah.
what's funny is looking back since the last interview, I realized that I had your bandmate Kevin, keyboard player for Moist. I had him on episode 96, and we were saying before we started recording that it feels like it's maybe been a year or so since you and I did the interview. And then I look back, and my interview with Kevin has already been way over a year. So
It's crazy.
time's been flying. And then guitar player in Moist, Jonathan, what's funny is after we did our interview 2.5 years ago, he saw that interview. And I think I had posted that I was driving home from Quebec, just on the other side of Ottawa, but on the Quebec side from my sisters. And he goes, Joel, you know that I live right there. Like you drove right by me. And like I had never met him before. I was just aware of him as a member of Moist. And I didn't know that I guess at some point during the pandemic he had moved over close enough to me. And I found out that he was a hockey player, but he hadn't played since moving over to this area. So it'd been a few years since he'd played. So I'm a goalie, so I get called almost every day of the week to play. It's like a bass player. Every band needs a
Right.
bass player.
Yeah.
Every hockey team needs a goalie. So I just talk to different teams that I'm on, and right away, a few days later, got Jonathan out, and they loved him because he's such a nice guy, and he's actually a good setup man. He's selfless. He lets everyone else get all the goals, and they picked him up, and I was playing with him once a week on one of my teams,
Oh,
and
perfect.
I'll be playing with him on this Thursday coming up. So I've had
Oh,
this
that's great.
funny moist connection since the last interview.
Excellent. That's great. Awesome. Yeah.
Just getting to know everyone. So we have one fan question, and then we'll dive into your five favorite albums. So this is from Elizabeth Moon, who's a well-known Moist super fan. She says, I would like to know why Jeff chose to leave the band after the reunion tour and what made him decide to return. I love that he returned, and please let him know I miss seeing them live so much. So that's from Elizabeth. So
Oh, that's so nice.
yeah, you
Excellent.
had
Okay.
mentioned in the first interview reasons for leaving and coming back, but we have some brand new listeners
Yeah.
checking this out today.
No, for sure. No, it's very, very simple. When we regrouped in 2013, I had a 3-year-old at the time, and the band was very serious. And I loved getting back and doing the reunion tour, but the band was very serious about really making a go of it with new music and new recording and maybe getting a new record deal and all that kind of stuff. And I just knew from what it was like when I was 26 years old and didn't have a family, how much of a commitment that would be. And at that point, the other guys in the band who have kids, their kids were like in high school and like at the point where they're no longer needed. And I just simply didn't want to I didn't want to miss anything. I didn't want to miss any part of seeing my kid, go through those years. So that was just the priority that I took. And I went back into the band when, as kids they get older and they start needing you less. And I also kind of wanted to show Charlie, who's my son, kind of what his dad had done in a way. And it was the best thing was when I came back into the band. The first show that we did was playing with live at the Festival d'été in Quebec, the FEQ, I believe they call it, uh, and in front of 15,000 fans. So that was his first sort of, he'd heard about it, he'd heard something about it, but that was the first chance he had actually had to see it in action. So now I'm back in the band because now I want to show Charlie that it's following your dreams is as important as anything in this life.
He thought you were just some schmuck at home, but he didn't know dad was a rock star.
Exactly. He had no clue.
We
Yeah.
had to show him what's up.
Yeah.
That's too
Yeah.
funny.
He still finds it kind of it's still a little bit abstract for him. So
And you're looking back on that time where you made sure you were around to be there with him and raise him. You're happy with that choice,
oh
obviously,
my
the
God,
time you got
absolutely
to
for sure.
spend.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I had a 9 to 5 job at the time as well. And so being able to be home on weekends and evenings and sometimes my 9 to 5 job would mean that I could take it wasn't actually 9 to 5. So I was spending days with him and I kind of worked an opposite shift as my wife, where she would work later in the day and I would start working later in the morning so I could take him to school every single day. So I walked him to school every single day from the time that he was in junior kindergarten until he no longer needed someone to walk him to school in like whatever that was, beginning of grade 6, I guess. So yeah. And I wouldn't trade any of that for anything.
I think you made the right choice there.